URLs and views are a super important feature, or two super important features, which you need in every Django app you're building, every Django project you're building. With views, you can define what should happen when a certain URL is entered in the browser. And a view, in its simplest form, is just a Python function. So here we could have a function named index, because this view might serve as our starting page, or we want to load our starting page here, and hence I'll name this index, since we also typically name the starting page file index.html. But it doesn't have to be named index. You can name this welcome or starting page or whatever you want. But I'll name it index also because later this will be there to show an index, a list of all the available meetups. Now, in here, in this index function, I then want to return a response to the browser, which in the end tells the browser what to display on the screen. And that's important. I want to return a response here because this function, this view function here, will be invoked automatically by Django. So we will not call it manually somewhere in our code. Django will call it when we have an incoming request for a certain URL. So therefore here we want to return a response. And for that we need to import from Django HTTP the HTTP response class here. And we can then instantiate HTTP response here and then define the content which we want to return. For example, hello world, a simple string which I'm returning here. With that, I'm saying when this function gets invoked, I want to send back a HTTP response to the browser which carries this page content. Now this index function also needs to take an argument, a parameter, which will be provided automatically by Django, and that's the request parameter. Again, this will be passed in automatically when Django calls this function for us later. Now, speaking of that, to make sure that Django calls this function for an incoming request, we need to tell Django when this should be called, and we do this with help of URLs. Now we got this URLs py file in our folder here, which holds our project name as a name, but actually we should also add such a file to this meetups app, because every app should have its own URLs that belong to this app, and then in a second step we can also set up, or we can connect those app-specific URLs with the global project-wide URLs. Now therefore here in this meetups folder, we can add a URLs py file, and in there we should add a URL patterns variable, and make sure that you don't have a typo in there. It has to be named URL patterns, written exactly like this, because Django will be looking for a variable with that name in that file. So it should be named URL patterns, and it holds a list as an argument. And in that list here, we now register all the URLs that belong to this app and which view functions should be executed when requests reach those URLs. For this to register those routes, those different URLs, we again have to import something from, in this case, Django.urls. So from this Django package, and from there we import the path function. And then here we call path inside of this list to create a new path. So calling path returns such a URL pattern object here, and this should be a list of such objects. Now this path function which we call here needs at least two arguments. The first one describes the path after our domain for which this URL and this view, which we'll soon add, should become active. And this could be meetups, for example. If we do that, we would say that for our domain.com/meetups, this path should become active. Then, as a second argument here, we can specify, or we have to specify, the view function that should be called by Django if a request reaches that URL. And therefore, I will import from this current folder my views file, my views module, and then here point at index. And very important, don't execute index, just point at it. Point at this function by just referring to it like this, so that Django is able to execute it for you once we got such an incoming request. Now we tell Django that we have this path and which view should be executed. Now the only remaining step is that we need to connect this app here to our overall project. And for this we should go to this Django core site project folder and there to settings py. And first of all, there you'll find this installed apps list here. And in there you can add your own app, meetups in my case. So that name which I chose for my app before. You can add it here at the end or at the beginning of that list here, it doesn't matter. Now that's one step we should do. It's also important for when we later start working with models and the database. The more important step at the moment though is that we go to the urls.py file in this project folder, and there we now connect our overall project's URL list here, this URL patterns list, with our app URL patterns list. And we do that by also importing the include function from Django URLs here. And then we can register a new path here. We also have a default path here, which we can ignore for now. This will become important later. And here we now need to again add our path, and we can just use an empty string here as a path for now. And this then can be used as a prefix for the URLs we defined in our app-specific urls.py file. Now here I have meetups as a path, and the idea is that we overall handle requests to our domain.com/meetups. Therefore, I don't want to write meetups here in my project-specific urls.py file, because instead I just want to use this as a prefix. And that's why we imported this include function. We can now call this here, and this allows us to include all the URLs from another urls.py file, from another URL patterns list, into this URL patterns list with this as a prefix in the path, in the URL. And here we pass a string to include, and then we use our folder name, meetups.urls. So the file name where that URL patterns list is stored, without the file extension though. And with that, we ensure that when we have a request coming in for our domain/meetups, it will always reach this file first. Here we don't handle it, but we see that we have basically a wildcard, an empty string here, which lets through that request to the URLs defined in meetups URLs. And here we do find meetups as a path, and therefore such a request would be handled by this page here. And actually, as a side note, you should add meetups/ here instead of just meetups, because if you do add a /, you ensure that it does not matter whether you visit our domain.com/meetups/ or just /meetups. If you don't add the / here, if a user enters our domain.com/meetups/nothing, he or she will get a 404 error because that's technically a different URL. So adding a / here is a good idea. I did forget it here. I will add it later behind the scenes. You can add it here already to avoid this problem. And now this is connected. And this was a lot of wire up work, But now we defined our first URL for this first app which we added and the view function that should be executed if a request reaches that URL. So now it's finally time to see that all in action. And for this, we can again use that manage.py file and start a little development server with help of that file, which is a server that runs locally on our computer and which is only there for us to test our website locally without deploying it. And we start this server by running python manage.py and then the run server command. Now here I get a warning, and we can ignore that warning for now. The server is up and running. You can always quit it by pressing Ctrl+C, but now you can also visit your demo website by entering localhost 8000 in the browser. And what you'll see here is that I get an error, a 404 error for a page not found. And the reason for that is that I entered localhost 8000/nothing. And here we only have one for meetups. So overall, /meetups, not for /nothing. And therefore, if I do enter /meetups here now, we now see hello world. And that is now our first URL and our first view in action. And I did spend quite some time getting to that rather simple and uninspiring result, but these are core mechanisms at work here, and it's important that you understand that you have apps in your project and how you do set up URLs and views and how you do wire up all those things, because you'll need that in any Django project you're building. But with that, we now got our first view wired up here, and at the moment I'm returning hello world. And that's of course typically not what we do want to return. Instead, we now want to return a full HTML file instead of just such a plain string, so that we can bring a more realistic page onto the screen.